Sarah Martinez stepped out of the military transport vehicle, her boots hitting the dusty ground of Camp Warrior with a soft thud. The desert heat immediately wrapped around her like a heavy blanket, but she was used to it by now. What she wasn't used to were the stares that followed her every movement as she walked toward the base headquarters. Her uniform was crisp and perfectly pressed, her posture straight and confident. But it was impossible to miss the network of scars that covered the left side of her face and neck, disappearing beneath her collar. The scars were pale against her olive skin, creating an intricate pattern that told a story she rarely shared with anyone. As she approached a group of soldiers gathered near the mess hall, their conversation died down. She could hear the whispers that followed her, the same ones she'd heard at every new posting over the past 3 years. "Did you see the new communications specialist?" One young private whispered to his friend, not quite quietly enough. "What happened to her face?" "Probably some training accident," another replied. "They shouldn't put someone like that in a position where she has to deal with people. It's unsettling." Sarah kept walking, her expression neutral. She'd learned long ago that reacting to such comments only made things worse. Besides, she had a job to do, and she intended to do it well, regardless of what others thought about her appearance. The base commander, Colonel Williams, greeted her at the headquarters entrance. He was a tall, stern-looking man in his 50s, with graying hair and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. "Sergeant Martinez, welcome to Camp Warrior," he said, extending his hand. "I've heard excellent things about your work in communications and intelligence gathering." "Thank you, sir," Sarah replied, shaking his hand firmly. "I'm ready to get started."
"Good to hear."
"Let me show you to your quarters first, then we'll get you oriented with your team." As they walked through the base, Colonel Williams briefed her on the situation. "We're in a challenging position here, Sergeant. This region has been relatively quiet, but intelligence suggests that might be changing. We need someone with your skills to help us stay ahead of any potential threats." Sarah nodded, taking mental notes of everything she observed. The base was well organized, with clear sight lines and good defensive positions. The soldiers she passed looked competent and well-trained, though she noticed the curious glances and occasional double-takes when they saw her scars. Her quarters were small but functional, with a single bed, a desk, and a locker for her belongings. After Colonel Williams left, Sarah unpacked her few personal items, including a small framed photo of her family and a worn copy of a technical manual on advanced communication systems. As she arranged her things, she could hear voices from the adjoining rooms. The walls were thin, and it was clear that word of her arrival had already spread. "I heard she's some kind of communications expert," one voice said. "But seriously, those scars, what kind of accident could do that?" "Maybe it wasn't an accident," another voice replied, lowering to a whisper. "Maybe she cracked under pressure or something. You know how some people just can't handle the stress." Sarah closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She'd heard variations of these conversations more times than she could count. People always assumed the worst, always created their own stories to explain what they didn't understand. The truth was far different from their assumptions, but she'd learned that explaining rarely changed people's minds. They saw the scars and immediately jumped to conclusions about her competence, her mental state, or her worthiness to serve alongside them. Later that afternoon, she reported to the communications center, where she would be working with a team of 6 other specialists. The center was impressive, filled with state-of-the-art equipment for monitoring radio frequencies, satellite communications, and digital intelligence gathering. Staff Sergeant Mike Chen, the team leader, introduced her to the others. He was professional but distant, and she could see the uncertainty in his eyes as he looked at her scars. "Sergeant Martinez will be taking over the advanced systems monitoring," he announced to the team. "She comes with high recommendations from her previous assignments." The other team members nodded politely, but Sarah could feel their discomfort. During the initial briefing, she noticed how they avoided making direct eye contact with her, how they seemed to position themselves so they couldn't see the scarred side of her face. Despite the awkward atmosphere, Sarah threw herself into her work. She quickly familiarized herself with the equipment and began reviewing the communication patterns and intelligence reports from the past 6 months. Her trained eye immediately picked up on several anomalies that had been overlooked. "Staff Sergeant Chen," she said during her first team meeting, "I've noticed some irregularities in the radio traffic from Sector 7. The patterns suggest possible coordinated movement, but it's been dismissed as routine patrol activity. Chen looked at the data she'd compiled, his eyebrows raising slightly. This is very thorough analysis, Sergeant. How did you pick up on this so quickly? Experience, sir. I've seen similar patterns before. Sarah kept her explanation brief, not mentioning the circumstances under which she'd gained that experience. Over the next few days, Sarah continued to prove her competence, identifying potential security risks and improving the efficiency of their monitoring systems. However, the social isolation persisted. During mealtime, she often found herself eating alone, as other soldiers seemed reluctant to approach her table. The whispers continued too, growing more elaborate with each retelling. Some claimed she'd been disfigured in a training accident due to her own negligence. Others suggested she'd been captured and tortured, implying that she might be mentally unstable as a result. A few even whispered that she'd been injured while abandoning her post during combat. Each story hurt more than the last, not because of the speculation about her appearance, but because of the assumptions about her character and abilities. These people didn't know her, didn't know what she'd sacrificed or what she'd accomplished, yet they felt free to judge her based solely on her scars. One evening, as she worked late in the communications center, she overheard two junior soldiers talking in the hallway outside. I don't understand why they assigned someone like her to such an important position, one said. I mean, look at her. How are we supposed to trust someone who obviously couldn't even protect herself? Maybe they felt sorry for her, the other replied. Gave her a desk job so she could feel useful again. Sarah's hands stilled on the keyboard. The casual cruelty of their words hit her harder than she'd expected. She'd thought she'd developed a thick skin over the years, but apparently she still had vulnerabilities. She finished her work and returned to her quarters, where she sat on her bed and looked at the photo of her family. Her parents and younger brother smiled back at her from happier times before everything changed. They knew the truth about her scars, about what she'd done to earn them. They saw her as a hero, but here, surrounded by people who should understand military service and sacrifice, she was seen as damaged goods. As she prepared for bed, Essera made a decision. She would continue to do her job to the best of her ability, regardless of what others thought. She would prove her worth through her actions, not her words. And if that wasn't enough for them, that was their problem, not hers. But deep down, she couldn't help hoping that someday someone would see past the scars to the person she really was. Someone who understood that sometimes the deepest wounds were earned in the service of others, and that true strength wasn't measured by unmarked skin, but by the willingness to bear those marks with dignity. Outside her window, the desert night was quiet except for the distant sound of patrol vehicles and the whisper of wind across the sand. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new whispers, and new opportunities to prove herself. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to push away the hurt, focusing instead on the mission ahead. She had work to do, and she intended to do it well, regardless of what anyone thought about the scars that told a story they couldn't begin to understand. 3 weeks into her assignment at Camp Warrior, Sarah had established herself as the most skilled communications specialist on the base, even if few people were willing to acknowledge it openly. Her daily reports were thorough and insightful, her equipment maintenance was flawless, and her ability to detect potential threats in radio chatter was unmatched. Despite her professional success, the social dynamics remained challenging. The mess hall conversation still quieted when she approached, and she often found herself eating alone while groups of soldiers chatted and laughed at nearby tables. The isolation was beginning to wear on her more than she cared to admit. One particularly hot Tuesday morning, as Sarah was calibrating the long-range communication array on the roof of the communications building, she noticed Staff Sergeant Chen approaching with a new soldier she hadn't met before. The young man looked to be in his early 20s, with sandy brown hair and nervous eyes that darted away the moment they landed on her scars. "Sergeant Martinez," Chen called out, "I'd like you to meet Private Danny Rodriguez. He's been assigned to our team as a trainee in advanced communication systems." Sarah climbed down from the array and extended her hand to the young private. "Welcome to the team, Private Rodriguez." Danny hesitated for a moment before shaking her hand, his grip weak and uncertain. "Thank you, Sergeant. I'm looking forward to learning from you." The awkward pause told Sarah everything she needed to know about what he'd heard. She decided to address it head-on, as she sometimes did with new team members. "Private, whatever you've heard about me, I'd prefer you judge me based on my work. I'm here to train you in communication systems. and I'm very good at what I do." Danny's face flushed red. "Of course, Sergeant. I didn't mean to imply—" "You didn't imply anything," Sarah said gently. "But I've been around long enough to know that people talk. What matters is how well you learn and how effectively you can do your job when it counts." Over the following days, Sarah worked closely with Danny, teaching him the intricacies of the communication systems and showing him how to read the subtle patterns in radio traffic that could indicate potential threats. Despite his initial nervousness, Danny proved to be a quick learner with a natural aptitude for the technical aspects of the job. As they worked together, Sarah began to notice that Danny was genuinely interested in learning from her, regardless of her appearance. He asked thoughtful questions about signal analysis, listened carefully to her explanations of equipment maintenance, and even started eating lunch with her in the mess hall, much to the surprise of other soldiers. "Sergeant Martinez," Danny said one afternoon as they monitored incoming transmissions, "can I ask you something personal?" Sarah looked up from her console, wary. "Depends on what it is, Private." "How do you stay so calm when they stare or whisper? I've noticed it happening, and it makes me angry on your behalf." "But you never seem to let it affect your work." The question caught Sarah off guard. In her 3 years of dealing with reactions to her scars, no one had ever asked her about the emotional side of it, let alone expressed anger on her behalf. "You learn to compartmentalize," she said finally. "My job is to protect this base and the people in it, through communications intelligence. That's more important than what anyone thinks about how I look." "But doesn't it hurt?" Danny pressed. "I mean, these people are supposed to be your teammates." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering how much to reveal. "Yes, it hurts," she admitted. "But I've learned that I can't control what people think or say. I can only control how I respond to it." Their conversation was interrupted by an urgent signal on one of the monitoring stations. Sarah immediately switched to professional mode, her fingers flying across the controls as she isolated and analyzed the transmission. "This isn't routine traffic," she said, her voice sharp with concentration. "Private Rodriguez, pull up the frequency analysis from Sector 12 and cross-reference it with the patterns we discussed yesterday." Danny worked quickly, his training evident in the smooth way he operated the equipment. "I'm seeing repeated patterns here, Sergeant. This looks like coordinated communication between multiple units." "Exactly, and look at the timing." Sarah highlighted several data points on her screen. "These transmissions are synchronized with our patrol schedules. Someone has been watching us." Sarah immediately contacted Colonel Williams, who arrived at the communications center within minutes. She briefed him on their findings, showing him the evidence of coordinated surveillance that had been building over the past 2 weeks. "This is excellent work, Sergeant Martinez," the colonel said, studying the data. "How long would it take to triangulate their positions?" "Give me 2 hours, sir. Private Rodriguez and I can set up a tracking protocol that should pinpoint their locations." As Sarah and Danny worked to track the hostile communications, word of their discovery spread through the base. For the first time since her arrival, Sarah found herself at the center of positive attention. Soldiers stopped by the communications center to check on their progress, and she could see a new respect in their eyes, even if some still seemed uncomfortable with her appearance. The tracking operation was successful, leading to the identification of 3 surveillance posts that had been monitoring the base's activities. A tactical team was dispatched to investigate, and they discovered evidence of a planned attack that had been scheduled for the following week. "Outstanding work, both of you," Colonel Williams said that evening as he debriefed Sarah and Danny. "Your vigilance and skill likely saved lives and prevented a significant security breach." The successful operation marked a turning point in how some of the base personnel viewed Sarah. Her technical skills could no longer be dismissed or overlooked, and a few soldiers even began to seek her out for advice on communications-related matters. However, the change wasn't universal. While some people began to treat her with professional respect, others seemed to resent her success. She overheard comments suggesting that she was showing off or trying too hard to prove herself. Some even implied that she deliberately withheld information until she could make a dramatic reveal. One evening, as Sarah was working late to prepare a comprehensive security assessment based on their recent discoveries, she overheard a conversation in the hallway that made her blood run cold. "I still don't trust her," a voice said. Sarah recognized it as belonging to Corporal Jenkins, a soldier from the security detail. Think about it. How convenient that she just happened to discover this threat right when people were starting to question why she was here. What are you suggesting? Another voice replied. I'm saying maybe she had information about this all along. Maybe those scars aren't from some heroic incident. Maybe she was working with the enemy and got burned when things went south. Now she's trying to rebuild her reputation by feeding us just enough information to look like a hero. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she continued working, trying to focus on her computer screen while the cruel speculation continued outside her door. The accusation was so unfair, so completely divorced from reality, that it left her feeling physically sick. She thought about confronting the soldiers, about defending herself against their baseless suspicions, but she knew from experience that trying to argue with people who had already made up their minds usually only made things worse. Instead, she threw herself even deeper into her work, analyzing every piece of communication data with obsessive attention to detail. She would let her results speak for themselves, even if some people were determined to see conspiracy where none existed. Danny noticed her change in demeanor the next day. Sergeant, are you okay? You seem different. I'm fine, Private. Just focused on making sure we don't miss anything important. But Danny wasn't easily fooled. Someone said something, didn't they? About you, I mean. Sarah looked at the young soldier who had become not just a trainee but something close to a friend. His genuine concern was both touching and painful, reminding her of how isolated she'd become from normal human connection. Private Rodriguez, there will always be people who question your motives, your abilities, or your loyalty. The key is to never let their doubts become your own. You know who you are and what you're capable of. Don't let anyone take that away from you. Danny nodded, but she could see that he wanted to say more. Sergeant, for what it's worth, I think you're one of the best soldiers I've ever worked with, and I don't care what anyone else says about it. His words meant more to Sarah than he could possibly know. In a world where she often felt like an outsider looking in, having one person who saw her for who she really was made all the difference. As the days passed, Sarah continued to excel at her job while navigating the complex social dynamics of the base. Some soldiers had begun to treat her with genuine respect, recognizing her skills and contributions. Others remained suspicious or uncomfortable, unable to see past their own prejudices and assumptions. Through it all, Sarah held on to the knowledge that she was doing important work, protecting people who might never appreciate her sacrifice. It wasn't the recognition she craved, but it was enough to keep her going. One day at a time, one successful mission at a time. The scars on her face might tell a story that others couldn't read correctly, but Sarah knew the truth. And someday, perhaps, that truth would be enough to change how people saw her. Until then, she would continue to serve with honor, regardless of whether anyone understood what that service had cost her. The attack came at dawn on a Thursday, just as Sarah had predicted, based on the communication patterns she'd been tracking. The base alarm system screamed across Camp Warrior, jolting everyone from sleep as incoming mortar rounds began exploding around the perimeter. Sarah was already dressed and at her workstation in the communications center when the first shells hit. She'd been monitoring suspicious radio chatter since 0400 hours, and the increasing frequency of coded transmissions had told her that something was about to happen. All units, this is base communications. She spoke clearly into her headset as explosions rocked the building around her. We have multiple incoming projectiles from the northeast. Tactical teams Alpha and Bravo report to defensive positions 7 and 12. The communications center quickly filled with personnel as the base coordinated its response to the attack. Colonel Williams arrived within minutes, his uniform hastily thrown on but his demeanor completely focused. Sergeant Martinez, what's our situation? He called out over the noise of the alarms and distant explosions. Sir, based on the radio intercepts from the past hour, this appears to be a coordinated assault involving at least 3 separate groups. They're using our previous patrol schedules to target weak points in our perimeter defense. Sarah's fingers moved rapidly across her console, coordinating with different units and relaying critical information about enemy positions. Despite the chaos around her, she remained calm and professional, her voice steady as she guided defensive operations through the communication network. Private Rodriguez worked beside her, his earlier training evident in how smoothly he operated the backup systems. Sergeant, I'm picking up additional chatter from the south. It sounds like they're planning a secondary assault once our forces are committed to the northeast. Good catch, Private. Colonel Williams, we need to keep reserves available for a potential southern attack. The colonel nodded, immediately adjusting the deployment orders. Sarah's early warning and Danny's quick analysis had potentially saved the base from a devastating flanking maneuver. As the battle intensified, Sarah found herself at the center of the base's defensive coordination. Her ability to intercept and decode enemy communications gave the defenders a crucial advantage, allowing them to anticipate attacks and redirect resources where they were needed most. However, not everyone was willing to trust her judgment. During a particularly intense exchange, when Sarah tried to warn about an incoming assault on the eastern gate, Corporal Jenkins questioned her information. "How do we know she's not leading us into a trap?" he said loudly enough for several people to hear. "This whole attack could be part of some larger plan. Maybe she's been feeding information to the enemy all along." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud, even as explosions continued to rock the base around them. Several soldiers looked uncertainly between Sarah and Jenkins, clearly unsure what to believe. Colonel Williams stepped forward, his voice cutting through the noise and confusion. "Corporal Jenkins, Sergeant Martinez's intelligence has been accurate throughout this entire engagement. Her warnings have saved lives and prevented our defenses from being overrun. I suggest you focus on your own responsibilities and let her do her job." The rebuke was sharp and public, leaving Jenkins red-faced and silent. But Sarah could see that the seeds of doubt had been planted in some minds, even in the middle of a life-or-death situation. She pushed the hurt aside and continued her work, coordinating with the tactical teams and providing real-time intelligence updates. When a group of enemy fighters attempted to breach the southern perimeter, Sarah's early warning allowed the defenders to repel the assault with minimal casualties. The battle lasted for nearly 6 hours, with periodic lulls followed by renewed attacks. Throughout it all, Sarah remained at her post, her expertise in communications proving invaluable to the base's survival. By late afternoon, the enemy forces had withdrawn, leaving behind evidence of a well-planned assault that had been successfully thwarted. In the aftermath of the attack, as the base assessed damage and casualties, the full scope of Sarah's contribution became clear. Her interception of enemy communications had provided advance warning of every major assault. Her coordination of defensive units had prevented the base from being overrun, and her analysis of attack patterns had helped identify and neutralize the enemy's strategic advantages. "Sergeant Martinez," Colonel Williams said during the post-battle briefing, "I want to commend you on exceptional performance under fire. Your communications work today was instrumental in our successful defense." Several officers nodded in agreement, and Sarah could see a new level of respect in their eyes. However, she also noticed that some soldiers, including Jenkins and a few of his friends, remained skeptical and resentful. Later that evening, as the base began to return to normal operations, Sarah overheard a conversation that revealed the depth of some people's suspicions. "I still think there's something fishy about the whole thing," Jenkins was saying to a small group near the mess hall. "She claims to have intercepted all this intelligence about the attack, but how do we know she wasn't in contact with them all along? Maybe this was all planned to make her look like a hero." "Come on, Jenkins," another soldier replied. "She saved our lives today. Her warnings were spot on." "Or maybe that's exactly what they wanted us to think," Jenkins continued. "Look at her. Those scars, the way she keeps to herself. There's something not right about her story. And now suddenly she's the base hero? It's too convenient." Sarah felt her heart sink as she listened to the conspiracy theories being spun around her actions. No matter what she did, no matter how well she performed or how many lives she saved, there would always be people who saw her scars and assumed the worst about her character and motivations. The next morning brought news that made the situation even more complex. Intelligence reports confirmed that the attack on Camp Warrior had been part of a larger coordinated assault on multiple military installations in the region. Sarah's base had been the only one to successfully repel the attack with minimal casualties, largely due to the early warning and tactical coordination she had provided. Colonel Williams called Sarah into his office to discuss the broader implications of the intelligence she had gathered. "Sergeant, your work yesterday has attracted attention at the highest levels. Division Command wants a full report on your methods and findings. They're also considering expanding your role to include regional intelligence coordination." Sarah felt a mix of pride and apprehension. Recognition for her skills was gratifying, but she knew that increased visibility would also bring increased scrutiny and potentially more suspicion from those who already doubted her. Sir, I'm honored by the confidence, but I want to make sure my current team and responsibilities are properly covered. Private Rodriguez has shown remarkable progress under your training. I'm confident he can handle increased responsibilities while you take on this expanded role. As Sarah left the colonel's office, she reflected on how much had changed in just a few weeks. She'd gone from being an outsider viewed with suspicion to being recognized as a key asset to base security. Yet the whispers and doubts persisted, reminding her that acceptance was still fragile and conditional. That afternoon, she received an unexpected visitor. Master Sergeant Lisa Chen, Staff Sergeant Chen's wife and a military counselor, stopped by the communications center. Sergeant Martinez, do you have a few minutes to talk? Sarah was surprised by the visit but agreed to take a break from her work. They walked to a quiet area outside the building, where Lisa got straight to the point. I wanted to apologize for how some people have treated you since you arrived. My husband included. We made assumptions based on your appearance, and that was wrong. Master Sergeant Chen, you don't need to. Yes, I do, Lisa interrupted. Yesterday's attack showed everyone who you really are and what you're capable of. But honestly, we should have given you that respect from the beginning. A soldier's worth isn't determined by their scars or their appearance. The conversation was both healing and painful for Sarah. It was gratifying to receive an apology, but it also highlighted how much judgment she'd been enduring without anyone acknowledging it. I appreciate that, Master Sergeant. Really. But I've learned not to take these things too personally. People react to what they see, and sometimes what they see isn't the whole story. Lisa studied Sarah's face, taking in the scars that had been the subject of so much speculation. Would you be willing to tell me the real story? Not because I'm curious, but because I think people need to understand what those marks really represent. Sarah hesitated. She'd kept the truth about her scars private for so long that sharing it felt almost foreign. But something about Lisa's genuine concern and respect made her consider opening up. It's not an easy story to tell, Sarah said finally. The best ones never are, Lisa replied gently. As they sat in the fading desert light, Sarah found herself sharing details she'd kept locked away for years. The weight of carrying that story alone had been heavier than she'd realized, and having someone truly listen, without judgment or assumptions, felt like a gift she hadn't expected to receive. The conversation marked another turning point in Sarah's time at Camp Warrior. While she still faced skepticism and suspicion from some quarters, she now had allies who understood her worth and were willing to stand up for her. It wasn't universal acceptance, but it was a foundation upon which real respect could be built. As the sun set over the desert, Sarah felt a cautious optimism about her future at the base. The scars on her face would always be visible, and there would always be people who made unfair assumptions about them. But perhaps, with time and continued strong performance, she could earn the kind of respect that transcended appearances and was based on the content of her character and the quality of her service. 2 months had passed since the attack on Camp Warrior, and Sarah's reputation as a communications expert had spread throughout the regional command structure. Her expanded role in intelligence coordination had led to several successful operations, and her methods were being studied and implemented at other bases. Despite her professional success, the social dynamics at Camp Warrior remained complicated. While many soldiers now respected her abilities, there was still an undercurrent of suspicion and discomfort that she couldn't entirely escape. The scars on her face continued to be a source of speculation and whispered theories. On a particularly busy Tuesday morning, Sarah was deep in analysis of intercepted communications when Private Rodriguez burst into the communications center, his face flushed with excitement and anger. "Sergeant Martinez, you need to see this," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "What is it, Private?" "There's a news report about you, about what really happened to give you those scars." Sarah felt her stomach drop. She'd always known that the truth might surface eventually, but she'd hoped to control when and how that happened. "Show me." Danny pulled up the news article on one of the center's computers. The headline read, "Decorated Hero's Identity Revealed, the Woman Behind the Scars." Below it was a photo of Sarah from 3 years earlier, before her injuries, standing next to her unit in Afghanistan. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she read the article. It detailed the mission that had changed her life forever, the mission that had given her the scars that everyone at Camp Warrior had been speculating about for months. According to the report, Sergeant Sarah Martinez had been part of a special operations unit conducting a rescue mission in enemy territory. Their objective had been to extract a group of captured aid workers, including 2 American doctors and a local translator, who had been working to provide medical care to civilians in a contested region. The mission had been compromised from the beginning, with enemy forces anticipating their arrival and setting up an ambush. Sarah's unit had found the hostages, but they were trapped in a building surrounded by hostile fighters. The only escape route was through a narrow corridor that was under constant sniper fire. According to witness reports included in the article, Sarah had volunteered to create a diversion that would allow the hostages and her teammates to escape. She had moved through the building, drawing enemy fire while providing cover for the evacuation. During the firefight, an improvised explosive device had detonated near her position, causing severe burns and shrapnel wounds to her face and neck. Despite her injuries, Sarah had continued to provide covering fire until all the hostages and her fellow soldiers were safely evacuated. She had been the last person to leave the building, carried out by her teammates only after she had lost consciousness from blood loss and smoke inhalation. The article went on to describe how Sarah's actions had saved 7 lives that day, and how she had been awarded the Silver Star for her heroism. It also explained how she had requested to continue serving in an active capacity, despite being offered a medical discharge and disability benefits. As Sarah finished reading, she became aware that the communications center had fallen silent. Looking around, she realized that several soldiers had gathered behind her, reading the article over her shoulder. Their faces showed a mixture of shock, shame, and dawning understanding. "Sergeant Martinez," Danny said quietly, "why didn't you ever tell anyone?" Before Sarah could answer, Corporal Jenkins appeared in the doorway. His face was pale, and he looked as if he'd seen a ghost. It was clear that he, too, had read the article. I need to apologize," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I said terrible things about you. I made accusations that were, God, I'm so sorry." Word of the article spread through Camp Warrior like wildfire. Within hours, Sarah found herself at the center of attention in a completely different way. Soldiers who had avoided her for months now approached her with expressions of respect and apology. Some were too embarrassed to meet her eyes, clearly remembering their own contributions to the whispered campaigns against her. Colonel Williams called her into his office that afternoon. When she arrived, she was surprised to find that he wasn't alone. A distinguished-looking man in a general's uniform sat across from the colonel's desk. "Sergeant Martinez," Colonel Williams said, standing as she entered, "I'd like you to meet General Patricia Hayes, the regional commander." Sarah snapped to attention and saluted. General Hayes returned the salute and gestured for her to sit down. "Sergeant Martinez, I've been following your work here at Camp Warrior with great interest. Your performance during the recent attack and your ongoing intelligence contributions have been exceptional." "Thank you, ma'am. I also want to address the article that was published today. I understand it may have put you in an uncomfortable position having your personal history exposed without your consent." Sarah chose her words carefully. "Ma'am, I've always preferred to let my current work speak for itself, rather than relying on past actions." General Hayes smiled. "That's exactly the kind of character I would expect from someone with your record. However, I think it's important that people understand what your service has cost you and what your scars really represent." She paused, looking directly at Sarah with eyes that held both compassion and steel. "I've read the full report of your actions in Afghanistan, Sergeant. What you did that day was nothing short of heroic. You put the lives of others before your own safety, and you continued to serve even when many people would have chosen to step away from military service." "I was just doing my job, ma'am." "No, Sergeant. You were doing far more than your job. And the fact that you've continued to serve with distinction despite facing ignorance and prejudice from people who should know better speaks to your character and dedication." General Hayes stood and walked to the window, looking out at the base where soldiers were going about their daily duties. "I've heard about some of the treatment you've received here, Sergeant Martinez. The whispers, the speculation, the unfair assumptions. That stops now." She turned back to face Sarah. "I want you to know that your actions in Afghanistan are part of your official record, and anyone who questions your courage, your loyalty, or your competence will answer to me personally." The meeting concluded with General Hayes offering Sarah a promotion and a transfer to a prestigious assignment at regional headquarters. However, to everyone's surprise, Sarah requested to remain at Camp Warrior. "Ma'am, I appreciate the offer, but I feel like my work here isn't finished yet. I've built relationships with the team, and I believe I can continue to make a significant contribution to base security." General Hayes studied her for a moment, then nodded approvingly. "I respect that decision, Sergeant. Loyalty to your team and mission is another mark of excellent character." That evening, the atmosphere in the mess hall was dramatically different from what Sarah had experienced in previous months. Instead of whispered conversations that stopped when she approached, soldiers actively sought her out to express their respect and apologize for their previous behavior. Staff Sergeant Mike Chen approached her table, his face showing genuine remorse. "Sergeant Martinez, I owe you an apology. I let my own discomfort with your appearance affect how I treated you professionally. That was inexcusable, especially given your record and your performance here." "Mike," Sarah said, using his first name for the first time, "we all make mistakes. What matters is how we move forward from here." Similar conversations continued throughout the evening, with soldier after soldier approaching to acknowledge their misjudgments and express their newfound respect. While Sarah appreciated the apologies, she couldn't help feeling sad that it had taken a news article for people to see her as worthy of basic human dignity. Private Rodriguez, who had remained loyal throughout her time at the base, sat with her as the crowd of apologetic soldiers finally thinned. "Sergeant, how do you feel about all this? People finally knowing the truth?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "Relieved, I suppose, but also a little sad that it was necessary. I would have hoped that my work here would have been enough to earn people's respect, regardless of how I got these scars." "It should have been," Danny agreed. "But people can be stupid and judgmental. At least now they know who you really are." "The thing is, Danny, I was always the same person. The scars didn't change who I am inside. They just changed how people saw me." Later that night, Sarah sat in her quarters looking at her reflection in the small mirror above her sink. The scars were still there, as prominent as ever. But for the first time in years, she felt like people were finally seeing past them to the person underneath. The revelation of her true story had changed the dynamic at Camp Warrior, but Sarah knew that the real test would come in the following weeks and months. Would this new respect and understanding last, or would it fade as people became comfortable again and forgot the lesson of their own prejudices? She thought about the young soldiers who might arrive at future assignments bearing their own scars from service and sacrifice. Would they face the same ignorant speculation and unfair judgment that she had endured, or would her experience help create a more understanding and supportive environment for those who came after her? As she prepared for bed, Sarah made a decision. She would use this moment of revelation and recognition to advocate for others who might face similar challenges. Her scars had always told a story of sacrifice and service, but now that people knew how to read that story correctly, she could help them understand that every scar, every mark of service, represented someone who had given something of themselves for others. The next chapter of her time at Camp Warrior would be different, but Sarah was determined to make it count for more than just her own vindication. She would work to ensure that the lessons learned from her experience would benefit others who deserved respect and understanding from the beginning, not just after their heroism was proven beyond doubt. 6 months after the revelation of her true story, Sarah Martinez had become one of the most respected soldiers at Camp Warrior. The transformation in how people treated her was remarkable, but more importantly, she had used her experience to create lasting changes in the base's culture and approach to supporting wounded veterans. The morning sun cast long shadows across the base as Sarah made her way to the communications center, where she now led a team of 12 specialists. Her promotion to staff sergeant had been unanimously supported by her colleagues, and her expanded responsibilities included training programs for wounded warriors transitioning back to active duty. As she entered the communications center, she was greeted by the familiar sight of her team working efficiently at their stations. Private Rodriguez, now Specialist Rodriguez, had become her second in command and was training 2 new team members who had recently arrived at the base. "Good morning, Staff Sergeant Martinez," called out Specialist Jenny Walsh, one of the new arrivals. Jenny was a young woman who had lost her left arm in an improvised explosive device attack, but had fought to continue her military career in communications. When she'd first arrived at Camp Warrior, she'd been nervous about how she would be received by her new colleagues. "Good morning, Jenny. How's the new equipment integration going?" "Better than expected, Staff Sergeant. The modifications you suggested are working perfectly." Sarah smiled, remembering her own first days at the base when she'd wondered if she would ever be accepted for who she was, rather than judged for her appearance. The changes that had occurred since then were profound and far-reaching. The transformation had begun almost immediately after the news article revealed her heroic actions in Afghanistan. General Hayes had been true to her word, implementing new policies throughout the regional command that addressed how wounded veterans were integrated into their new assignments. Sarah had been asked to lead the development of these policies, drawing on her own experiences to create guidelines that would prevent other soldiers from facing the isolation and prejudice she had endured. The new protocols included mandatory sensitivity training for all personnel, clear procedures for addressing discrimination, and support systems for wounded veterans transitioning to new roles. But perhaps most importantly, Sarah had established a mentorship program that paired experienced wounded veterans with newly assigned soldiers who were dealing with visible or invisible injuries from their service. The program had been so successful at Camp Warrior that it was being implemented at bases throughout the region. Staff Sergeant Martinez, Specialist Rodriguez called out from his monitoring station. "We're getting some interesting patterns in the morning intelligence briefings. It looks like our counterparts at Camp Desert Shield are implementing some of your communication protocols." Sarah walked over to review the data, pleased to see that the methods she'd developed were being adopted by other bases. Her reputation as an intelligence expert had spread far beyond Camp Warrior, and she'd been invited to speak at conferences and training sessions throughout the military communications community. "That's excellent news, Danny. The more bases that use coordinated communication protocols, the more effective our regional security becomes." As she reviewed the morning reports, Sarah reflected on how much her role had evolved. She was no longer just a communications specialist trying to prove her worth. She was a recognized leader who was helping to shape military policy and culture. The changes weren't limited to official policies and procedures. The social atmosphere at Camp Warrior had also transformed significantly. The mess hall conversations that had once excluded her now regularly included discussions about her latest projects and initiatives. Soldiers who had once whispered about her scars now sought her advice on everything, from technical problems to career decisions. More importantly, the base had become a more welcoming environment for all soldiers dealing with the aftermath of injuries or trauma. When Sergeant Marcus Thompson had arrived 3 months earlier with severe scarring from burns sustained in a vehicle attack, he'd been immediately integrated into the community and given the support he needed to excel in his new role. "Staff Sergeant Martinez," Thompson had told her recently, "I can't imagine what this place must have been like when you first arrived. Thank you for changing things for those of us who came after you." Sarah had been deeply moved by his words, realizing that her struggles had indeed served a larger purpose. The isolation and prejudice she'd endured had motivated her to create systemic changes that would benefit countless other veterans. Colonel Williams had also played a crucial role in implementing and supporting these changes. During their monthly leadership meetings, he often praised Sarah's contributions not just to base security but to the overall morale and culture of Camp Warrior. "Your influence extends far beyond the communications center," Staff Sergeant Martinez, he'd told her during their most recent meeting. "You've helped create an environment where every soldier can contribute their best work, regardless of their physical appearance or the injuries they've sustained in service to their country." The success of the mentorship program had been particularly rewarding for Sarah. Watching wounded veterans find their place in the military community and thrive in their new roles gave her a sense of purpose that went beyond her technical responsibilities. One of her most successful mentorship cases involved Corporal Lisa Kim, a former infantry soldier who had lost partial vision in one eye and struggled with post-traumatic stress. When Kim had first arrived at Camp Warrior, she'd been convinced that her military career was over, and that she would never be able to contribute meaningfully to her unit's mission. Through the mentorship program, Sarah had worked with Kim to identify her strengths and find ways to apply them in a communications role. Kim's experience with tactical operations proved invaluable in analyzing enemy movement patterns, and her determination to succeed had impressed everyone who worked with her. "You taught me that my worth as a soldier isn't determined by my injuries," Kim had told Sarah. "You showed me that I could still serve with honor and make a real difference." These success stories had caught the attention of military leadership at the highest levels. Sarah had been invited to present her mentorship program model to the Department of Defense, and there were discussions about implementing similar programs throughout all branches of the military. As the day progressed, Sarah found herself reflecting on her journey from isolation to leadership. The scars on her face were still there, still visible to everyone who met her. But they no longer defined how people saw her or limited what she could accomplish. In fact, those scars had become a symbol of something positive. They represented not just her own sacrifice and service, but the potential for overcoming prejudice and creating positive change. New soldiers arriving at Camp Warrior often asked about her story, not out of cruel curiosity, but because they wanted to understand how she'd turned a difficult situation into an opportunity to help others. That afternoon, Sarah received a call that would mark another milestone in her evolving career. General Hayes was on the line with news that would have seemed impossible just a year earlier. Staff Sergeant Martinez, I'm calling to inform you that you've been selected for promotion to Sergeant First Class, effective immediately. Additionally, you've been chosen to lead a new regional initiative focused on wounded veteran integration and support. Sarah felt a surge of pride and gratitude. The promotion was significant, but the opportunity to expand her impact across the entire region was even more meaningful. Thank you, ma'am. I'm honored by the confidence you're showing in me. The confidence is well earned. Sergeant First Class Martinez, your work has demonstrated that the military is stronger when we support all of our service members and recognize that diversity of experience, including the experience of overcoming adversity, makes us more effective as an organization. As Sarah hung up the phone, she looked around the communications center at her team working together seamlessly. Specialist Rodriguez was training the new arrivals, Specialist Walsh was coordinating with other bases, and everyone was contributing their unique skills to the mission. It was exactly the kind of environment she'd hoped to create, where people were valued for their contributions rather than judged for their appearance or the circumstances that had shaped them. That evening, the base held a promotion ceremony in Sarah's honor. As she stood before her colleagues and friends, looking out at faces that now showed respect and genuine affection, she thought about how far she'd come since that first day when she'd stepped off the transport vehicle to whispered comments and suspicious stares. Colonel Williams presented her with her new rank insignia, and General Hayes spoke about the broader significance of Sarah's achievements. Sergeant First Class Martinez represents the best of military service, the general said to the assembled crowd. She embodies the values of courage, dedication, and selfless service that define our armed forces. But perhaps most importantly, she has shown us that our strength comes not from uniformity, but from our ability to support and value every member of our military family. After the ceremony, as Sarah mingled with her colleagues and accepted congratulations, she was approached by a young lieutenant who had recently been assigned to the base. Lieutenant Amy Chen carried herself with confidence, but Sarah could see the uncertainty in her eyes. Sergeant First Class Martinez, I wanted to thank you for what you've done here. I'm dealing with some challenges related to injuries from my last deployment, and I was worried about how I'd be received here. Sarah smiled, recognizing the familiar mixture of hope and apprehension in the young officer's voice. Lieutenant Chen, I want you to know that you're part of a team that values your skills and your service. Whatever challenges you're facing, we'll work together to help you succeed. As the evening wound down and the celebration gradually dispersed, Sarah stood outside the communications center looking up at the desert stars. The same stars that had witnessed her arrival at Camp Warrior when she'd felt isolated and judged. The same stars that had shone down during the attack that had proven her worth to her colleagues. And now, the same stars that illuminated a future filled with possibilities she couldn't have imagined when her journey began. The scars on her face would always be there, a permanent reminder of the sacrifice she'd made in service to others. But they no longer represented limitation or judgment. Instead, they had become a symbol of resilience, transformation, and the power of one person to create positive change in the lives of many. As she walked back to her quarters, Sarah Martinez, Sergeant First Class, felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She had not only overcome the prejudice and isolation she'd faced, but she had used that experience to build something lasting and meaningful. The military community was stronger because of the changes she'd helped implement, and countless future service members would benefit from the foundation she'd helped create. Her story had begun with laughter and whispers about her scars, but it had evolved into something far more significant, a testament to the power of perseverance, the importance of looking beyond surface appearances, and the potential for personal struggles to become the foundation for positive change that benefits everyone.